There was once a substance so precious that Roman soldiers received part of their wages in it. Merchants crossed deserts for weeks just to obtain a small quantity. Emperors stored it in locked vaults alongside gold coins. And yet, this was not a gemstone. It was not a metal. It was not a rare mineral from a distant land. It was a plant resin, a sticky, golden substance that oozed from the bark of a single tree species found only along a narrow coastal strip of North Africa. Its name was Silphium, and for 5 centuries, it was the most coveted commodity in the ancient Mediterranean world. Here is the paradox that makes this story so remarkable. Rome had access to pepper from India, silk from China, and ivory from sub-Saharan Africa. It had spices worth more than their weight in bronze. And yet Silphium, a wild plant, free for the picking along the limestone cliffs of what is now northeastern Libya, commanded prices that put all of those commodities to shame. A single pound of Silphium resin was worth a pound of silver. Not almost, not approximately, exactly. And unlike silver, you could eat it, heal with it, and preserve your food with it. So how does something that valuable simply vanish from the face of the earth? In this video, we are going to travel back to the ancient city of Cyrene, on the Libyan coast, where Silphium was discovered, worshipped, and ultimately destroyed. We will explore exactly what this plant was, why it was so extraordinarily valuable, and what it could actually do, medically, culinarily, and economically. Then we will uncover the troubling story of why it disappeared. And finally, we will ask the question that scientists are genuinely wrestling with today. Could Silphium still exist somewhere? And what might we have lost forever? Let us find out. To truly understand Silphium, you need to place yourself in Cyrene, in the year 631 before the Common Era. A group of Greek colonists, following an oracle from the god Apollo at Delphi, sailed south from the island of Thera, what we call Santorini today, and landed on a fertile plateau above the Libyan coast. The land was dramatically different from anything the Greeks had seen. Green valleys cut through white limestone cliffs, springs of fresh water fed a rich ecosystem, and growing wild across the hillsides was a plant unlike any other they had encountered. The locals called it something the Greeks would later transcribe as Silphion. The Romans would shorten it to Silphium. The city of Cyrene grew prosperous almost immediately, and scholars believe Silphium was the primary reason. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, described the region's wealth in terms that left little ambiguity. Cyrenian coins, some of the most beautiful coins ever minted in the ancient world, bore the image of the Silphium plant on one side and a Silphium seed on the other. That is the rough equivalent of a modern nation putting oil wells on its currency. The plant was not just a product. It was the economic identity of an entire civilization. So what exactly was Silphium? Botanists believe it was a member of the Ferula genus, the same broad family that includes Asafoetida, a pungent spice still used today in Indian and Persian cooking. Think of the Ferula family as the wild ancestors of a group of plants that produce powerful aromatic resins from their roots and stems. Silphium, however, appears to have been a unique species within that family, one adapted specifically to the microclimate of the Cyrenaican plateau. The particular combination of limestone soil, coastal winds, and seasonal rainfall found only in that narrow strip of land. It could not be transplanted. It could not be cultivated in gardens. It grew wild, or it did not grow at all. The plant itself stood roughly a meter tall, about 3 feet. It had thick, hollow stems, bright yellow flowers that bloomed in clusters, and broad leaves that ancient artists depicted with care on pottery and mosaics. But the most valued part was not the leaves or the flowers. It was the resin, a thick, gum-like sap that collected inside the root and the base of the stalk. Harvesters would cut into the base of the plant and allow the golden sap to seep out slowly over several days. This resin, once dried, was called laser, and laser was the active ingredient that gave Silphium its extraordinary range of uses. Now, what could Silphium actually do? The ancient sources are remarkably consistent, and the list is staggering. The Greek physician Hippocrates, often called the father of Western medicine, mentioned it in his writings as a treatment for sore throat, fever, indigestion, and warts. The Roman encyclopedist Pliny the Elder devoted an entire section of his natural history, written around 77 of the Common Era, to Silphium's medicinal properties. He listed it as effective against coughs, pleurisy, sciatica, and joint pain. He also noted that it was used to treat animal bites and to help wounds heal more quickly. And that was just the medical side. In the kitchen, Silphium was the seasoning of the Roman world. The only surviving complete Roman cookbook, written by a wealthy gastronome named Apicius in the 1st century of the Common Era, mentions Silphium, or its cheaper substitute, in the majority of its recipes. Romans used it the way we might use garlic or pepper today, as a foundational flavor that elevated everything from roasted meats to lentil soups to honey cakes. The flavor has been described by scholars as a combination of garlic, fennel, and something entirely its own. Warm, slightly bitter, with a long finish that lingered pleasantly on the palate. It made food taste more alive. But there was a third use, one that made Silphium genuinely controversial in ancient times and deeply fascinating to historians today. Multiple Roman and Greek sources suggest that Silphium was used as a contraceptive. The Roman poet Catullus, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, referred to it in an erotic context. The ancient physician Cyrene of Ephesus, in his gynecological treatise, described a specific preparation of Silphium resin to be taken as a monthly dose to prevent pregnancy. And here is the detail that makes modern researchers pay very close attention. The heart-shaped Silphium seed, the one stamped on Cyrenean coins, bears a striking resemblance to what we now recognize as the universal symbol for a human heart. Some historians, including John Riddle of North Carolina State University, have proposed that the heart symbol itself may have originated as a stylized representation of the Silphium seed, precisely because of its association with love, desire, and intimacy. This remains a theory, not a proven fact. But Riddle's 1994 book Eve's Herbs, which examined the history of contraception in the ancient world, presented a compelling body of evidence suggesting that Silphium was genuinely pharmacologically active as a contraceptive agent. His research pointed to the broader Ferula genus, several species of which do contain compounds that can interfere with fertility in laboratory tests. So here, in one wild plant, you had a culinary powerhouse, a broad-spectrum medicine, and quite possibly a reliable method of birth control, all wrapped in a golden resin that smelled extraordinary and tasted unlike anything else on earth. Is it any wonder that the Romans valued it more than silver? The ancient Roman Senate reportedly kept a stockpile of Silphium resin in the treasury alongside gold and silver reserves, as a strategic commodity. Julius Caesar, when he seized the treasury during his civil war conflict in 49 before the Common Era, is said by Pliny to have found approximately 1,500 pounds of Silphium stored there. That single cache would be worth millions of dollars in today's equivalent purchasing power. And yet, within barely 100 years of Caesar's raid on the treasury, Silphium was gone, completely, irrevocably. The Roman Emperor Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 of the Common Era, is recorded by Pliny the Elder as having received what was described as the very last surviving stalk of Silphium as a gift, a curiosity, a relic. Nero reportedly ate it, not preserved it, not studied it, not replanted it. He ate it. And with that single act, symbolic or not, the last known specimen of the most valuable plant in the ancient world disappeared into history. What happened? How does something this precious simply cease to exist? The answer lies in a combination of factors that should feel painfully familiar to anyone living in the 21st century. The first and most fundamental problem was that Silphium could never be domesticated. Every attempt to cultivate it in gardens outside Cyrenaica failed. Roman agricultural writers documented multiple experiments, transplanting roots, sowing seeds in similar soils, attempting to replicate the coastal microclimate. All of them failed. The plant simply refused to grow outside its native habitat. This made it, in modern economic terms, a non-renewable resource. You could only harvest what nature provided, and nature provided it only in one specific place on Earth. The second factor was the nature of Cyrene's political situation. For most of the period when Silphium flourished, the Cyreneans themselves managed the harvest with deliberate care. Ancient records suggest they understood that over-harvesting would destroy the resource, and there are accounts of controlled cutting seasons and limits on how many plants could be tapped in a given year. This was, in essence, a form of conservation management, rudimentary by modern standards, but effective enough to sustain the harvest for roughly 4 centuries. The Cyrenians knew which side of their bread was buttered, as we might say today. But in 96, before the Common Era, Cyrene passed from Greek control into Roman hands. The city was bequeathed to Rome by its last king, Ptolemy Apion, who died without an heir. And with Roman control came a fundamentally different economic philosophy. Where the Cyreneans had managed Silphium as a long-term asset, carefully rationing the harvest to preserve the supply, the Romans approached it as a commodity to be extracted as quickly and profitably as possible. Roman merchants, operating under no local regulatory framework and motivated purely by short-term profit, expanded the harvest dramatically. There was also a second, compounding ecological problem. The same limestone plateau where Silphium grew wild was increasingly used for sheep and goat grazing. Ancient sources, including Strabo, the Greek geographer writing around 20 before the Common Era, noted that the Silphium range had contracted dramatically because herds of sheep had eaten the young plants before they could reproduce. Silphium apparently was extraordinarily palatable to grazing animals. They sought it out specifically, consuming not just the leaves but the roots, preventing any natural regeneration. This was the slow-motion destruction of an ecosystem that had taken thousands of years to develop. Think of it this way. Imagine discovering that a certain wild mushroom, found only on the slopes of one particular mountain, produced a substance that cured the common cold, tasted better than truffles, and sold for the price of gold. Then imagine that no one managed the harvest, that goats ate most of the young growth before it could mature, and that every trader who visited the mountain tried to take as much as possible before the next trader arrived. That is exactly the dynamic that destroyed Silphium. And it is a dynamic that human beings have repeated, tragically, predictably, dozens of times throughout history. By the time Pliny the Elder was writing his natural history, around 77 of the Common Era, he spoke of Silphium in the past tense, as something that had existed within living memory but was now effectively gone from the Cyrenaican plateau. He noted that in his own lifetime, only a single specimen had been found, and that it had been sent to the Emperor Nero as a wonder. Pliny wrote, and I am translating here, that Silphium had not been seen in Cyrenaica for many years, because the publicans, the Roman tax-farming contractors who managed the land, had found it more profitable to stock the region with cattle than to protect the plant. That phrase, the publicans found it more profitable, deserves a moment of pause. The Roman publicani were private contractors who paid the government up front for the right to collect taxes and manage public land in a region. Once they had paid that fee, their incentive was to maximize short-term extraction, not long-term sustainability. They were not evil men, necessarily. They were rational actors within a system that rewarded immediate profit and punished patience. Sound familiar? This is the same logic that has driven the destruction of fisheries, forests, and aquifers in the modern world. The tragedy of Silphium is not just a Roman story. It is a human story. The loss of Silphium sent ripples through the entire Mediterranean economy. Roman cooks who had relied on it for generations were forced to find substitutes. The most widely adopted replacement was a plant called Asafoetida, known in Latin as Laser parthicum or Parthian laser, imported from Persia and Afghanistan. Asafoetida smelled far more pungent than Silphium, and ancient writers were unanimous in their verdict. It was an inferior substitute. Pliny himself called it a poor imitation, yet Asafoetida was the only option available, and it became the standard substitute that Roman and later medieval cooks would use for centuries. You can still buy Asafoetida today at Indian grocery stores, typically sold under the name hing. For nearly 2,000 years after Nero's fateful meal, Silphium existed only in texts, on coins, and in the collective culinary memory of Mediterranean civilization. Medieval herbalists mentioned it as a lost wonder. Renaissance scholars debated which modern plant it might correspond to, but nobody could find it, grow it, or confirm its identity with certainty. It became, in the language of botany, a ghost species, a plant known only from historical descriptions and artistic depictions, with no surviving specimens, no preserved seeds, no DNA to analyze. For botanists, it was one of the most tantalizing cold cases in the history of natural science. And then, in 2021, something extraordinary happened. A Turkish botanist named Mahmut Miski, based at Istanbul University, published a paper proposing that a plant called Ferula drudeana, a rare member of the Ferula genus, first formally described in 1909 and found growing in a single mountainous region in central Turkey, might be the long-lost Silphium. Miski's argument was careful and methodical. He compared ancient artistic depictions of Silphium, its leaf shape, flower structure, and seed form, with the morphology of Ferula drudeana. The match, he argued, was remarkably close, closer than any other candidate proposed in the previous 5 centuries of scholarship. Miski's paper, published in the journal Plants in March of 2021, attracted immediate attention from both the botanical community and the popular press. He noted that Ferula drudeana grows in the Hasan Dagi volcano region of Cappadocia in Turkey, a high-altitude, rocky, mineral-rich environment with some ecological similarities to the Cyrenaican Plateau. He also pointed out that the plant is extraordinarily rare. Only a handful of known populations exist, each containing relatively few individual plants. And critically, it had never been extensively studied for its chemical composition. Nobody had asked what was actually inside it. Miski and his colleagues at Istanbul University subsequently conducted a preliminary phytochemical analysis, meaning they tested the plant's chemical makeup to see what compounds it contained. Think of phytochemical analysis as a kind of molecular fingerprinting. You grind up a plant, run it through a sophisticated spectrometer, and get a readout of every chemical compound present. The initial results were, in Miski's own words, promising. The plant contained a suite of compounds in the sesquiterpene class, a family of organic molecules known for antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, and hormone-disrupting properties. In other words, exactly the kind of chemistry you would expect from a plant with Silphium's reported range of effects. One compound in particular attracted special attention, a sesquiterpene called ferutinin, which occurs in several Ferula species and has been studied for its effects on reproductive hormones in mammals. A 1999 study published in the Journal of Natural Products found that ferutinin could bind to estrogen receptors in animal models, a mechanism that would be entirely consistent with Silphium's reported use as a contraceptive. This does not prove that Ferula drudeana is Silphium, and it does not constitute medical advice. But it does suggest that the ancient claims were not purely mythological. The chemistry is at least plausible, and that is a significant finding. There is also an intriguing parallel in the culinary chemistry. Several volatile aromatic compounds found in Ferula drudeana belong to the same sulfurous, garlic-adjacent chemical family that characterizes asafoetida and other Ferula relatives used as spices. If you have ever smelled asafoetida, and if you have not, imagine a very intense combination of garlic and onion with a slightly sulfurous edge. Then you have some approximation of what Silphium's flavor profile may have belonged to, albeit in a much more refined and pleasant form according to ancient writers. The chemistry suggests a plant that was genuinely, powerfully aromatic in ways that would have made it irreplaceable in ancient kitchens. But here is the critical question that Miski's research has raised. If Ferula drudeana is indeed Silphium, or even a close relative with similar properties, what does that mean for the plant's survival today? The answer is alarming. The known populations of Ferula drudeana in Turkey are small and fragmented. The plant grows very slowly, takes years to reach reproductive maturity, and occupies a restricted habitat that is under pressure from agricultural expansion and grazing. Exactly the same pressures that destroyed the original Silphium population 2,000 years ago. The story risks repeating itself before we have even confirmed the identification. In 2022, the Turkish government placed Ferula drudeana under formal botanical protection in its known habitats, restricting grazing, prohibiting collection, and initiating a seed banking program at the Botanical Garden of Istanbul University. This was not purely out of ecological altruism. There was growing scientific and economic interest in the plant's potential pharmaceutical applications. If the ferutinin content and other bioactive compounds proved significant in clinical studies, the commercial value of the plant could be enormous. There was, in other words, both a scientific and a financial incentive to keep this plant alive. Whether that protection will prove sufficient remains to be seen. Now, what does all of this mean for you, today, in practical terms? The honest answer is, quite a lot, even if you never encounter Silphium directly. The spice most likely to serve as a culinary bridge to Silphium's flavor world is asafoetida, the ancient substitute. It is widely available at Indian and Middle Eastern grocery stores, typically sold in small yellow tins or dark resin lumps, for between $3 and $8. It is extraordinarily pungent raw, but it transforms completely when touched by hot oil, mellowing into a warm, savory, garlicky depth that is genuinely unlike anything else. If you cook lentils, stews, or roasted vegetables, a pinch of asafoetida added to hot butter or oil will change the dish completely. If Ferula drudeana is ultimately confirmed as Silphium or a close analog, the implications extend well beyond the kitchen. Modern pharmaceutical research into Ferula compounds is already underway at multiple institutions. A 2020 review published in the journal Molecules examined over 40 biologically active compounds isolated from various Ferula species, finding significant evidence for anti-inflammatory, antifungal, and neuroprotective effects. Some researchers are exploring Ferula-derived compounds as potential leads in the treatment of chronic inflammatory conditions, the kind of persistent, low-grade inflammation linked to arthritis, metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular disease. The ancient physicians may have been onto something far more significant than anyone realized. There is also a broader lesson here about the relationship between wild plants and human civilization, one that speaks directly to a value you may recognize from your own experience. For most of human history, the most powerful medicines, the most transformative flavors, and the most effective tools came not from factories or laboratories, but from an intimate knowledge of what grew in the local landscape. That knowledge was accumulated over generations, refined through careful observation, and passed down through communities that depended on it for their survival. When the plants disappeared, or when the knowledge was lost, it was not just an ecological loss. It was a civilizational loss. The Silphium story is, at its heart, a story about what happens when short-term economic incentives overwhelm long-term ecological wisdom. The Cyreneans understood, intuitively, that the plant's value depended on its survival. The Roman publicani understood only that there was profit to be extracted today. That tension, between the long view and the short view, between stewardship and extraction, is one of the defining tensions of every civilization that has ever existed. And it is a tension that is very much alive in the world right now, wherever you look, in fisheries, in forests, in aquifers, and in the pharmaceutical potential hidden in the wild plants that are disappearing from the earth, at a rate that would have horrified even the Romans. I want to stop here and ask you something directly, because your perspective genuinely matters on this topic. Many of you watching this have lived long enough to remember landscapes, plants, and food traditions that have since disappeared, local varieties of fruit or vegetable that no longer exist in stores, wild herbs that grew along roadsides before herbicides became routine, flavors from childhood that you simply cannot find anymore. What was lost in your lifetime? What plant, food, or practice do you remember from your early years that has since disappeared, or nearly so? Leave a comment below. I read every one of them, and I believe your living memory of these losses is itself a form of historical record worth preserving. The rediscovery story of Silphium also reminds us of something deeply encouraging. Even after 2,000 years, the knowledge did not completely vanish. It survived in coins, in cookbooks, in medical treatises, in the careful illustrations of ancient artists who drew the plant with botanical precision. That surviving record was enough. Barely enough, but enough, for a dedicated botanist in Istanbul in 2021 to make a connection that had eluded scholars for centuries. The lesson is that information, carefully preserved and passed down, has a power that outlasts empires. The Romans are gone. Their coins, their cookbooks, and their descriptions of a golden plant are still teaching us things. There is one more dimension to this story worth sitting with: the heart shape. If John Riddle and the historians who share his view are correct, then the most ubiquitous symbol in the modern world, the shape you see on Valentine's Day cards, on jewelry, on every love song ever visualized, may be the fossil of a lost plant. A plant that was associated with love, with fertility, with the pleasures of the body, for 500 years of Mediterranean civilization. The seed of Silphium, stamped on every coin minted in Cyrene, may have been so deeply embedded in the cultural vocabulary of love and desire that its shape survived even after the plant itself was gone, outlasting the Romans, the Byzantines, the medieval world, and arriving here, in our own time, as a symbol whose origin almost no one remembers. That is the kind of deep time connection that makes history feel genuinely alive. We are not separate from the past. We carry it with us, in our symbols, our flavors, our medicines, and our mistakes. Every time you season food, you are participating in a tradition that stretches back to people who lived around cooking fires in Mediterranean cities 3,000 years ago. Every time a pharmaceutical company extracts a new compound from a wild plant, it is following a trail blazed by healers who had no laboratories but extraordinarily sharp powers of observation. And every time a wild species disappears due to over-extraction and short-term greed, we are repeating a tragedy that the Romans themselves documented and could not prevent. The story of Silphium is ultimately a story of extraordinary value, extraordinary loss, and, perhaps, extraordinary rediscovery. Whether Ferula drudeana turns out to be the true Silphium, a close cousin, or merely the best candidate we currently have, the investigation is not over. Mahmut Miski and his team at Istanbul University continue their research. Seed banks are being established, chemical analyses are underway, and somewhere on the rocky slopes of a Turkish volcano, a rare plant that almost nobody knows about may be carrying within its roots the answer to a 2,000-year-old mystery. History, it turns out, is not always buried in the past. Sometimes it is still growing in the ground, waiting to be recognized. If this story has sparked your curiosity about what other lost plants, forgotten foods, or overlooked natural remedies might still be out there waiting for rediscovery, then you will want to watch our video on the lost orchards of medieval Europe, where entire varieties of apples, pears, and plums that fed generations of farmers were replaced by a handful of commercial varieties in the 20th century, and where a quiet movement of amateur pomologists and botanical historians is now racing to find and preserve the survivors before they vanish completely. The parallels with Silphium are striking, and the stakes are just as real. If today's journey into the ancient world left you wanting more stories about the plants, foods, and discoveries that shaped human civilization, and the forces that threaten to erase them, then subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new video. We release new episodes every week, exploring the intersections of history, science, and human ingenuity that are too fascinating to leave sitting in dusty libraries. Because the world is full of Silphiums, things of extraordinary value, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to pay attention. And paying attention, it turns out, is exactly what we are here to do.